Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this conference on such a beautiful sunny afternoon. I'm Phil Barton, and I'm the chair of Sustainability First. Sustainability First is a think tank and charity that seeks to drive informed change to promote and embed practical solutions for sustainability in the UK's essential services. I'd like to welcome you to this very timely conference on fairness in utilities and what the public purpose agenda means for companies, policymakers, and regulators. It's a culmination of our major Fair for the Futures project, which has been running since 2018, exploring with partners what the energy, water, and communication sectors can do to better address the politics around fairness and the environment. Earlier this month, we produced Regulation for the Future, the implications of public purpose for policy and regulation in utilities, written by Sustainability First Martin Hurst, who you'll be hearing from later. This significant report puts forward a comprehensive list of recommendations to help shape future regulation in the decades ahead. We've got a packed agenda this afternoon with a great programme of speakers. The conference will be a game of two halves. After some scene setting from our director, Sharon Darcy, the first half of the conference will examine what the public purpose agenda means for companies in the energy, water, and communications sectors. We're delighted that international leader in the field of corporate purpose, Professor Colin Mayer from the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford, will be delivering our first keynote address. Our distinguished panel of corporate leaders will then discuss how companies can put purpose into action and how policy and regulation might help or hinder purposeful business. After the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience. Throughout the event, please submit questions using the questions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can upvote questions others have asked so that the panel discusses those of most interest. And after that Q&A, we'll have a short break. The second half of the conference will examine how policy and regulation can best enable public purpose. We start with a keynote address from Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. Unfortunately, the Minister can't be here in person, but she has sent us a pre-recorded speech to share with us today. This will be followed by a short presentation on our report by our associate at Sustainability First, Martin Hurst. Then an expert panel from regulatory, government and investor leaders will discuss how policy and regulatory frameworks can facilitate public purpose. And again, following the panel discussion, there'll be an opportunity to take questions from the audience. Finally, we'll draw out the key conclusions from the day's discussions and highlight Sustainability First's major next steps in this area. We're live tweeting during the event, so please do share your thoughts using the hashtag #FairUtilities. And just to inform you, the conference will not be Chatham House, and we will be recording the event for YouTube. Before I pass over to Sharon to kick us off, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for what promises to be a highly stimulating and important discussion. I'd particularly like to thank our keynote speakers and panelists for agreeing to take part and sharing their views. Thanks particularly go to Sustainability First team, whose cutting edge research has shaped this programme, particularly our associates, Martin Hurst, Maxine Frerk, Judith Ward, Zoe McLeod and Fiona Smith, our research officer, Alan Cross, communications officer, Janine Duffy, and IT support, David Shields, as well as, of course, our director, Sharon Darcy. And last but not least, the sponsors for our work, many of whom have been with us since 2018. Without their sponsorship and support and challenge, this work would not have been possible. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Sharon to get us underway.
Thank you very much, Phil. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Phil. Utilities such as energy, water and communications are all essential services, essential for modern life, and they're key parts of our critical national infrastructure. ensuring that the companies that deliver these services and the policy and regulatory environments in which they operate are seen as fair is crucial. It's crucial to build trust within and between generations, and to ensure that we maintain the social contract whereby private capital is used to deliver public value. So Sustainability First set up our Fair for the Future project back in 2018 to help public utilities get better at addressing what we called the politics of fairness and the environment. That's politics with a small p. The project was established before the Labour Party made its proposals in terms of nationalisation and before the government's current commitment to net zero. Since 2018, the case for fairness has only increased, and the importance of public utilities delivering public value and on their purpose has only gone up. The context is changing. On the environment, it's not just an issue around decarbonisation. Utilities are also having to address issues around current and future climate impacts. And in the water sector, biodiversity is a big issue, and it's a big issue for other companies as well through their supply chains. The recent Treasury review by Dasgupta really sets out the importance of that challenge going forward. The social landscape is also changing. The deep social inequalities that underpin our society have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Levels of fuel and water poverty are increasing, and people are increasingly struggling with access to broadband issues. These problems have been significantly exacerbated by COVID. Deprivation and vulnerabilities are growing and shifting. Latest figures from Citizens Advice show that 1 in 3 people have lost income in the pandemic, and 6 million people have fallen behind on their bills. And technology as well is not standing still. Whilst this presents significant opportunities, AI and big data can also have potentially negative impacts in terms of legitimacy and the jobs that we do and meaningful work going forward. So we're in a period of what many commentators have called a decisive decade for decision makers, not just for the climate, but for fairness as well. And given the importance of utilities in our everyday lives, the energy, water and communication sectors are very much at the sharp end of dealing with these challenges. However, as anchor institutions in their local communities and key enablers of not just net zero, but also public health, they're also at the forefront of developing positive solutions. In monopoly utilities, we now have a window for change and a window to put public purpose into action with the end of the water price controls and to a slightly slower timetable in the energy networks as well with the end of those price controls. At Sustainability First, however, we think that there is another reason to look at purpose issues more fundamentally. It's now 30 years since the privatisation of the utilities sectors. We think a fundamental rethink of policy and regulation for the sectors is now needed. A rethink which considers what companies, policymakers, regulators and investors can do to work together to tackle the challenges that I've outlined, not pitted against each other, to deliver more sustainable outcomes. Yes, we've had significant activity at the CMA recently in terms of fairness issues, but this isn't a conference on the CMA and the work of the CMA, and the need for change goes much more widely. It's been recognised by the investor community. Larry Fink, Chief Exec of BlackRock, is increasingly talking about the issue of the sustainability premium. And he's highlighting how an increasing focus on environmental, social and governance, ESG factors in investment can drive long-term value creation. Companies themselves have also woken up to these issues. Many are doing significant work already in terms of sustainability fairness and purpose. And they're starting to get a better grip on how they report their social and environmental impacts. The government is also alive to the challenges, as we've seen with the 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution, the new National Infrastructure Strategy, and the Energy White Paper. Yes, the 6 carbon budget does point out the scale of the challenges that we're facing, but the case for change and the need for change has now been accepted. For utilities, the forthcoming Treasury review of economic regulation will be critical to ensure that regulatory frameworks are fit for the future. The reviews of regulatory duties and strategic policy statements have the potential to significantly shape regulation and purpose in the decades ahead. And the forthcoming Bayes review of affordability and fairness in energy has the potential to have a significant impact on that sector and more broadly. Sustainability First's work in these areas on fairness and purpose in utilities is absolutely central to these reviews. Whether you call it purpose or social value or public value, to some extent is neither here nor there. Let's not get hung up on the terminology. The key thing is to get a fundamental shift in corporate approaches, policy frameworks and regulation to enable utilities to get better at delivering the social and environmental and economic outcomes that we need to see, to turn these sectors from being part of the problem to being part of the solution for the future. Our research in the Fair for the Future project has systematically looked at how we can chart a way forward in these areas. Through our deliberative research, since 2018, we've carried out significant work in these areas. All of our research is on our website, so if you haven't looked, please do take a look. We began the project by asking what companies can do in this space. We started our research with companies and not government, as we consider that it's vital that if a company wants to use private capital to deliver public value and to be seen as trusted and legitimate, it needs to be able to demonstrate that it's having a beneficial public impact. In 2018, we produced a comprehensive straw man, which set out what we called a sustainable license to operate for the utilities sectors. Following extensive research, workshops which were multi-party, multi-stakeholder, and bilateral talk into action calls with companies, last year we produced a significant how-to guide which shows what good looks like in the utilities sectors in terms of purpose. The guide identifies 4 key themes which need to underpin a license to operate, the permission to work if you're a utilities. These include ongoing stakeholder engagement, the demonstration of delivery of public interest outcomes and public value, people and culture, and taking an integrated approach across a business. These themes and the how-to guide provide a comprehensive and tailored approach to purpose for public utilities. We then turned our attention to risk. We had already identified that given the changes that we're facing as a society, taking a compliance approach to sustainability would be necessary but not sufficient to deal with the challenges in the decades ahead. We asked ourselves how far utilities really understood the social and environmental context in which they worked and how this was driving their business and their risks. We reviewed company approaches to risk and their risk appetite statements. And we produced a guide for companies on board and boards on risk and resilience. Our risk framework provided one company with a valuable tool at the initial stages of the pandemic, which showed them how to react to the risks around COVID in a way which really resonated and reflected their values. Given the challenges companies can face in demonstrating that they're delivering on purpose and acting responsibly, particularly given the millstone of history that some face, poor services, bad performance, and in some cases excess returns, being able to demonstrate that companies are going above and beyond is important. So we also produced a guide to sustainability metrics, which really looked at the issue of ESG through a utilities lens. And we consider that this is really important for regulators and the wider stakeholders to be able to see beyond purpose wash. So there is a lot that companies in these sectors need to do to put purpose into action, but they don't operate in a vacuum. They operate within policy and regulatory frameworks. And this was the issue that we moved on to next. We were very lucky to have pro bono support over the last year from Slaughter and May to look at law, regulation and sustainability in selected utility sectors. And their final conclusion from this research was that companies, regulators and policymakers already have a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of their ability to put purpose and sustainability into action. The key issue is how they interpret and then implement the law. Building on this work and workshops that we carried out on stakeholder engagement and adaptive regulation, my colleague Martin Hurst, who will be speaking later, has now produced a significant report on policy, regulation and public purpose in utilities, and we'll be getting to that after the break. One of the key themes underpinning Martin's report is the issue of culture and how culture is important to driving purpose, both in companies and in policymakers and regulators. How do we move away from a culture that too often treats social and environmental issues as purely transactional, one-off customer problems, that's peripheral to the core business, or issues which are dealt with in silos in an organisation, or as goals to be competed for in a series of adversarial one-shot games? The principles that underpin economic policy and regulation are crucial here. We'll be coming back to these at the end of the conference. But to help us to more meaningfully understand how to get change in corporate cultures and regulatory cultures to support purpose, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Colin Mayer from the Saïd Business School, who's written extensively on this subject and has and spearheaded world-leading action in this area. So Colin, welcome to the conference and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. And let me start off by congratulating you on the excellent report that you and your team have produced on the implications of public policy for public purpose for policy and regulation in the utilities. It makes a powerful case for why corporate purpose is particularly important in the utilities and why it needs to be accompanied by purposeful regulation. But the question that raises is, what does that mean in practice? How practical is it to formulate corporate purpose in utilities and promote purposeful regulation that is significantly different from what has existed to date? I'll suggest that it's not only feasible and desirable, but it's essential. It's essential for the utilities, for regulators, and for the customers, societies, and environments they serve. Why is that the case? The answer I'd suggest is that the current system introduces an inevitable conflict between utilities and regulators. Companies are delivering profits to their shareholders, regulators are interested in the public good, restraining charges to customers, and ensuring that companies deliver on their services and asset management plans. The system ends up inevitably and almost invariably being confrontational, finishing at either the CMA or the Competition Appeal Tribunal, on which I served for some 8 years, adjudicating over numerous examples of the intricacies of that confrontation. But not only is it not inevitable that the system should operate like this, it's expensive, inefficient, and damaging that it does. It's furthermore relatively straightforward to correct. What lies at the heart of the problem are two things. The first is a dominant focus of companies on short-term profits, and the second is a regulatory system that is focused on relatively short-term periodic price settlements. While company law requires directors to have regard to other stakeholders in promoting the interests of shareholders over the long term, the way in which financial markets, as well as the law, operate lead to a preoccupation with profits. This, combined with periodic reviews, means that companies are predominantly concerned with profits over a 5-year period or so. Neither of these features are conducive to a utilities system that is there to promote the long-term well-being of customers, communities, or the environment. What is regarded by many as a mixed record of utilities since privatization is not, therefore, entirely surprising. What a purposeful agenda is designed to do is to think carefully about the purpose of utilities and their regulators, and to design both so that they are fit for delivering purpose. What corporate purpose does is to appropriately position the profits that utilities earn as being derived from the benefits that they confer on their customers, communities, and the environment, not from the detriments they create from any of them. And that comes from a deep understanding by utilities of the problems of their customers, communities, and the environment, and earning profits from solving those problems, not creating them. Purposeful regulation is then not just about the rules of the game and their enforcement, but also encouraging an alignment between the purpose of utilities and what their customers, societies, and environments are expecting and hoping of them. It therefore promotes an alignment between corporate purpose and social licenses to operate, ensuring that there is a process of consultation and public engagement through, for example, citizens' assemblies that identifies a common purpose between utilities and their customers and communities. The regulatory process should encourage the delivery of those purposes over the long term, which is not 5 years, but in general, intergenerational. What purposeful regulation then does is to position periodic reviews appropriately as 5-year strategies within purposes that promote intergenerational environmental and societal benefits. Purposeful companies, in turn, position their strategies within their intergenerational purposes to create long-term value from the benefits they confer on their stakeholders and undertake the long-term investments that are required to deliver them. It's a partnership in formulating the purpose and its delivery. It's not regulatory capture, but an active, ongoing engagement that tracks and corrects to ensure that companies remain on track in delivering their long-term purpose. Can this be measured and can it be accounted for? How in particular does one measure and account for the social as well as the environmental component associated with purpose? The answer is yes. It is measurable and it's becoming increasingly measurable. Take, for example, the tough question around inclusivity, access, and affordability. Well, we're observing the emergence of apps, social media, and AI that provide methods for obtaining and analyzing large volumes of data on the impact that utilities have on their customers and communities. In particular, they allow boards of companies to evaluate whether people in their organization, their customers and communities believe that they are authentically implementing their purpose. They provide information on the trust those parties have in the company and its trustworthiness with its employees, customers, and communities. They inform the company about the well-being and welfare of their stakeholders and the degree of distress they are experiencing in relation to services and their affordability. Some of the stresses associated with the interface between purposeful business and regulation have been observed in relation to PR19 in water and the conflict between companies seeking to fund long-term environmental and intergenerational social policies and the regulators' concerns about current affordability and charging for services. How can regulators reconcile these objectives and be sure that companies are not using purpose as a smokescreen behind which to hide excessive costs and profits? The answer, I believe, is by working with companies in ensuring that first, companies' purposes are determined through a rigorous process of consultation and dialogue with relevant stakeholders. Second, that they have appropriate ownership and governance arrangements for committing to and embedding purpose in their organizations. Third, that there is an alignment between the purposes, values, and culture of companies. Fourth, the appropriate way of measuring the resourcing and performance of companies is in place. Fifth, that the company is on target to deliver its purpose. And sixth, setting in place error correction mechanisms for putting the company back on track where it isn't on track. It's not very different in many respects to the process of what is required in terms of stewardship that investors should engage in, but focused instead of on just financial returns, on societal and environmental measures of purpose as well. Indeed, the key to success in this is to bring all of the boards of companies, investors, and regulators together in terms of how they view their roles and complement each other. The difference between water companies, their ownership and regulation in England and Wales, with Scottish Water, the Scottish Government, and Wicks in Scotland, is, I think, in some respects, instructive in that regard. The relation that's emerging between the three parties in Scotland is more along the lines of this type of collaborative, long-term adoption of purpose. Scottish Water consults and engages with stakeholders, its regulator and its shareholder, on its purpose, its strategy in relation to its purpose, its values and culture, its resourcing, the cost of its resourcing, its measures of performance in relation to its purpose and its performance against it. This builds trust between the different parties, establishes the trustworthiness of the water company in regard to delivering its purpose, and allows for long-term value creation in relation to that purpose. Does the public ownership of Scottish Water, or the fact that there is only one company, make Scotland fundamentally different from England and Wales? I think not. A company that has as its purpose to solve problems for its customers and communities profitably, not profiting from producing problems, is aligned with, not in conflict with, a public entity. In fact, it has an advantage. In addition to promoting the public interest, it has a private interest in doing so more efficiently and more innovatively than a public one. And the fact that there are multiple companies in the industry allows all of them and the regulator to use the information and experience that comes from comparing the experience of each of them against each other. But I want to end with a different sector from water, and that's energy. Clearly, the main purpose of energy companies at present is not simply to deliver energy, but also to achieve the energy transition of delivering energy that is not environmentally damaging. The last couple of years have witnessed a profound change in this recognition. There is a rush of commitments to net zero over different periods with different degrees of commitment and breadths of commitment to scope 3 as well as scopes 1 and 2, and measures against which to evaluate it and levels of plausibility of its fulfillment. But still more critical is whether these commitments also embrace the not profiting from producing detriments principle as well. Because there is a risk that in solving one problem, namely the environment, another is created, namely social exclusion, the inaccessibility and/or unaffordability of energy. The energy transition will not be achieved if in the process it excludes segments of a country or the world's population, or it increases the cost for them of access to energy. And the massive investments that will be required in renewables infrastructure and reskilling of employees must yield sufficient returns to encourage the private as well as the public sector to fund them. In other words, the importance of energy companies recognizing their purposes in profiting from solving energy problems, not producing them, and of investors and regulators in both supporting companies and ensuring they do this could never have been greater or more urgent. In sum, I commend the report that Sustainability First has produced as a tremendous framework within which to promote the creation of purposeful utilities and purposeful regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that inspiring address. You've given us a really good start to the conference and some really good ideas of practically how to align the interests of companies, investors, regulators, and wider stakeholders. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to now be joined by our first panel of speakers. And we've got some great speakers here who are going to explore some of these issues in a bit more detail, primarily from a company perspective. As we go into the panel, please do post your questions on the Zoom link. You can upvote each other's questions so that the panel will get to have a chance to answer some of the points you want to make. But the panel we have first off, we've got Dame Polly Curtis, who's the founder and director of the University of Cambridge Centre for Sustainability Leadership. And also Polly is a non-executive director on the board of Anglian Water. We're also delighted to be joined by Sul Ali, who's the Director of Strategy and Customer Services at UK Power Networks, and by Rachel McEwen, who's Chief Sustainability Officer at SSE and has also been a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission. So I'm going to ask Polly to join us first off. And Polly, if you could speak a little bit for 5 minutes about what you think companies can do to really demonstrate that they're delivering on their public purpose. Thank you, Polly.
Thank you, Sharon, and very great to join you all here today. I would really just like to add my congratulations and warm welcome for this really timely report, and to express real support also for the observations that Colin has made about just how critical it is that we do things differently now. I've seen at first hand over many, many years what it is that companies need to do to take a real leadership position. And in recent years, I've seen just how much importance companies, big companies all over the world, are attaching right now in, as you said, Sharon, in this decisive decade to build on their purpose in order to build trust and to demonstrate leadership in the face of the major challenges that we face, to do so in order to deliver long-term social and environmental value, as well as, of course, fair returns for their shareholders. I'm speaking not so much from the perspective of all those other companies, although I've learnt a great deal about what it takes to get that purpose embedded in companies, but I'm looking particularly from the point of view of Anglian Water and to how the utilities sector can deliver that public benefit directly linked to the core, to its core purpose. And as Colin has said, it's an absolutely crucial time right now, particularly in the water sector, as PR19 comes to an end. And in this window that we have before PR24 begins in earnest, to get that step change that we need, there's an incredible opportunity now to make that fundamental shift in how utilities are regulated. And from the water company perspective in PR24, in such a way that it will enable government and regulators to use all the levers at their disposal and to encourage utilities along this journey, really importantly recognizing and rewarding companies that are genuinely stepping up on the big challenges that we face, that are genuinely working to enshrine and fulfill their purpose to be innovative and creative and to deliver those long-term customer benefits and social and environmental value. So this is an opportunity perhaps to step back from that peak regulation era, strip out some of the complexity and work out how, as Colin says, regulation can be developed in a collaborative and complementary manner. But also I would say recognizing that there are going to be different ways of demonstrating that achievement, whilst never letting go of the need for there to be common outcomes in the interests of society and the environment, but recognizing that there will be differences in different local conditions. I've seen it firsthand from within Anglian Water. In fact, it's the main experience I have of seeing what it actually takes to embed this thinking into a company. And of course, it starts with having really strong governance through the boardroom. It's really important to have an evidence base to point to, ideally, I would say, third-party assurance against a recognized standard, but also demonstrating that this agenda is owned and driven from the top, but it's embedded in the culture, the values, and the fabric of the business, and must be accompanied by that evidence base. Anglian Water's core purpose is to bring environmental and social prosperity to the region we serve through our commitment to love every drop, which underlines the fact that water is crucial to the health and success of customers, communities, and our environment, taking a long-term view rather than short-term profit maximization. I can honestly say I've seen this company thinking that reflects the importance of that long-term view. And we've been working with customers, employers, and other stakeholders to bring this to life by co-creating with them a social contract, precisely to get that alignment between corporate purpose and the social license to operate. So looking at what the common challenges are that we face in our region, particularly a growing population and increased impact of climate change on water availability, but also trying to really explore in detail what role customers can play. So it's not just, but also helping them to think about go beyond just how they interact with the water they use, but the role that they can play in shaping our planning and decision making through things like our customer advisory board, our online community, the ambassador program, some really interesting engagement processes, which I can honestly say, looking at what I've seen around the world, this is world-class stuff that we've been seeing. But it's not just good enough, important as it is to talk to your customers, it has to actually be owned by every individual in the company. So not just something that's done by one department or through individual projects. In Anglian Water, they have this notion that every employee knows how they can build trust, do the right thing, and always exploring. Those are the things which the mantra which you hear people often quoting back when they want to do something. They say that's because it's part of always exploring, and using the 6 capitals framework to go beyond simply financial and manufactured capital in terms of the decision-making that's made. I just want to give one quick example. Wisbeach is a wonderful example of how this is owned and driven by so many different parts of the business. Wisbeach, this market town, which has faced a huge number of challenges, but has this amazing potential for growth and development. And in planning for water resources and engaging with the community, a whole load of other things have emerged as part of that process. So the original vision of that grassroots community work now has led to a proposal for a new garden town, 10,000 new homes, better transport links, more jobs, improved health, education, skills training for local people. A really wonderful, iconic project which demonstrates what a company can do when it embraces that notion of creating long-term social and environmental value. And of course, many of you will know Anglian Water adopted, in the more formal governance sense, they adopted their Articles of Association to enshrine that purpose in the company, placing an additional public interest and duties on the board. I can assure you, we spent months discussing precisely how this would work how we would balance the duty of the directors to deliver social, economic and environmental outcomes with reasonable expectations of shareholders to earn a fair return. So I found that really pivotal, the way in which this was codified into the company's approach. And the final thing to say, in recognition of the fact that you do have to have some way of demonstrating it, is that the company has worked with the British Standards Institute to develop, and in fact, together with my own organization, to develop a new publicly accessible specification created with multi-sector input to arrive at a consensus on the shared characteristics necessary to define sustainability, leadership, and purpose. To arrive at a common purpose, to harmonize many of the different standards. And I think only this week, a significant part of that project has gone live, and we're expecting to put it out for consultation and have it published within the next 9 to 12 months, which is a really important mechanism for getting a standard that we can all be accountable to. So I'll end there, but I'm optimistic that the need for companies to be purpose-driven can be dramatically enhanced by good regulation that is collaborative and has a different set of intent than perhaps the intent that, as Colin described up until recently, was the dominant feature of the landscape. So if I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Polly. And it's great to hear the customer issues coming into the conversation and understanding how they can really shape corporate purpose. I think we'll get to that issue in a moment. But first off, it would be great if we could now hear from Sulali and his experience of putting purpose into practice at UK Power Networks. Sul.
Hi, thanks, Sharon. Good afternoon, everyone. So I was just kind of toying with, what should I cover in this sort of short 5 minutes? I can talk about the past and where we've got to. I can talk about the future. So I'll try and do sort of 2 minutes on each. I joined UK Power Networks 5-6 years ago. We're a distribution company, and we own and operate 3 of the 14 networks in the UK. We were a poor performer on just about every measure you would use to assess a distribution company. And upon acquisition back in 2010, we set about resetting what this business is here to do and what its purpose is. And fast forward sort of 11 years, we're one of the best performing companies on just about every measure that you would use to assess a distribution company. And I don't think we could have achieved that scale of transformation were it not for some of the fundamental building blocks that we put in place back in 2010. And the first thing that we did was basically have a conversation both with our employees and our stakeholders, the regulator and our customers, on what is our purpose, what are we here to deliver? And we enshrined our purpose in a vision for the organization. And there were 3 things that we had then. There's another one that's going to be added soon, but 3 things. Being an employer of choice, which is about creating an environment where you have happy, healthy, engaged employees, and the employees that are safe when they come to work. We talked about being a respected and trusted corporate citizen, which talked about our service provision. It talked about how we're going above and beyond the boundaries of our organization. It talked about our environmental and our sustainability track record. And thirdly, it talked about being sustainably cost efficient, to the point that was raised by our first speaker about excessive focus on profits and not the long term. So we set about effective a vision. And I think what was different about our organization, we were talking about this before it became in vogue to talk about purpose, I think, was that we just went about it in our own utility way, which was, okay, what are we here to do? What does it mean? How do you measure it? Because we see a lot of organizations that talk about purpose, but it's so difficult to actually say, well, what are you going to do? How is it practical? How is it tangible for stakeholders and customers to understand what your intent is? So we did a fair bit of work to set targets and measures on those things that we could, and to use that to drive momentum within the organization. Fast forward 10 years, if you were to come into our business and talk to any employee, whether they be an apprentice that's been in the business 5 minutes, or whether they be someone who'd be 40 years, and you say to them, what's important? I'm pretty sure they'll be able to tell you, in fact, I'm certain they'll be able to tell you the 3 things in our vision and some of the things that, in terms of how they contribute to that vision. So that's a kind of our story today. And I think there's a number of other things, whether it be how we've put performance indicators across all levels of the organization aligned to the vision. I mean, basically, we're a performance-driven culture. So it was quite interesting to hear some of the speakers talk about, well, let's not get over-focused on measurement. My belief, based on history and track record, is if you can measure something and you go to that extra effort, whether it's a financial measure or whether it's a service measure or whether it's a social return on investment measure, if you can put some measurement behind it, it really does help to drive behavior, performance improvement, and actually motivation to show that you're making a difference. So that's kind of where we got to today, right? If we fast forward to the strategic context, you know, we can see a world where, in order for us to achieve net zero as a country, decarbonisation in this next decade is going to be a lot more intrusive than it has been in the last decade, right? It's going to impact how we, fuel our vehicles. It's going to impact how we heat our homes. It's going to impact basically how we generate electricity, if some of us may actually end up being producers. And therefore, in that context, right, you know, we've been thinking about our purpose, right? And we have a belief, a real fundamental belief that in order to deliver net zero at lowest cost, i.e. to build, maintain public support and confidence behind the concept of net zero, we think smart grids, open data, plus compelling customer propositions, which encourage, support consumers to consume when it's cheaper and greener to do so, are absolutely critical for this next phase of decarbonisation, because you're going to bring consumers with you as opposed to decarbonisation being done to them, right? Because of that belief, right, we think the future is going to look something like where there'll be a much more sort of ecosystem of people working together, organizations working together, including networks, including suppliers, including new entrants that don't exist today, who are basically putting the customer first and saying, how can we help consumers to make this transition in the lowest cost and most easy way possible, right? If you accept that as a premise and as a view of the future, you are not going to be able to achieve that without consumer trust, right? And therefore, it plays back to how your purpose needs to adapt for the future. And therefore, you need to be thinking about what could erode consumer trust in the future that's different from the past. So I still think there will be things that are important in the future that were important in the past. If you deliver a poor service, you don't have a license to operate. If you're not keeping your employees safe, you don't have a license to operate. So I think there will be certain things that you've just got to get the basics right, and you've got to deliver them exceedingly well. And then you've got to be, I guess, inquisitive, curious about what are the things that are impacting your customers and stakeholders, and what role can you play? So a great example of this one would be the concept of fairness, right? And I talk about this a lot in events like this, but you know, you talk about EV charging. Today, you can go and shop around and fill up fuel wherever you want to your heart's content, right? But in the future, if you've got an electric vehicle and you're blessed to have a driveway, you could be paying, you know, something like 5p per kilowatt, per kilowatt hour if you're on Octopus Go tariff or on OVO's tariff, right? But if you don't have a driveway, you're going to be reliant on a public charging infrastructure. You could be paying 6, 7, 8 times that if you're lucky enough to find a charger that works, right? So how are we going to address those gaps in provision that exist as a result of some of the changes that are happening? And what role do we play as a network company versus other organizations? So that for me is a great example of actually kind of projecting forward and saying, how will the energy transition impact communities, customers in different ways? What role can we play? Right? At a minimum, we should be calling out those gaps and saying there's a problem here, and then working proactively to come up with solutions, right? And I think where regulation comes in is basically to, in the first instance, they should get out of the way and help and allow companies to work with customers and community groups to try and solve these problems. And if those problems can't be solved, then regulation should be there as a force multiplier. Rather than saying what you can't do, it's, okay, what problem are you trying to solve? How can you solve those problems? Why is it that you should take that role? So I have a sense of optimism, I think, for regulation in the future, that, you know, certainly some of the things we've seen with our regulator Ofgem, whether it be the Green Recovery program, where we are trying to stimulate green recovery, you know, post-pandemic through investment in network infrastructure and flexibility. I think I'm starting to see sort of definite changes in our regulators, and it's now about, for me, it's about how we seize the opportunity going forward. But I think it all boils down to, where do we see the gaps in the future that could erode trust? And then how do we lean in, understand, sit around those campfires that you haven't necessarily sat behind, in the past, and actually understand the problem better, and then put some solutions forward? Sharon.
Thank you very much, Saul. And I really like the idea of regulation being a multiplier for good, and your optimistic view for the future. Before we start getting into the questions, we're very lucky to hear from Rachel McEwen from SSE. Rachel, you've got tremendous experience in the whole field of sustainability, but also on just transition issues. So please do share your thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me today, Sharon. Very good to be here, so to speak, and congratulations to you and Sustainability First for your project, the Purpose Report, and today's event. And I guess my job is to give another practical example of the way in which purpose can inspire practical action in the long-term interests of both company and stakeholders. And for all the reasons that Colin set out in his talk, SSE has enthusiastically embraced the ethos from the British Academy's Future of the Corporation project. We are one of a few companies that joined the project at the start, and we had some history as to why. We were already concerned about the relationship between business and society more generally. And those of us in the energy sector will remember the period around 2013 when prices were at the top of public discourse. It was a difficult time for the industry, and it made us think deeply about the nature of the public interest and our role in delivering it. And at that time, public complaints with big business were wider than just energy prices. It was as much wrapped up in the post-financial crash period and the notion that big business was able to use the levers of power, especially taxes and wages, to stack the system in their favour. Which is why, when the Future of the Corporation project was established, we thought it was right up our street. And Colin's mantra that the purpose of business is to find profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet was highly instructive to us at the end of 2018. We were undergoing a strategy and operating model review at the time, and as Colin points out, it is blindingly obvious that for an energy utility, SSE's purpose must be to find the profitable solution to climate change. And we have said so explicitly, and the achievement of net zero has been hardwired into our statements of company intent. But at the heart of this idea of purpose is this assumption that businesses must have a purpose in life that is higher than simply the profit motive. And for us, we've reflected this in our strategic objective and set out the goal of creating simultaneous value for shareholders and society. And we deliberately link our business goals to the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development. And it is this idea that makes you start to think differently. Social and environmental issues aren't just risks to be managed, they are opportunities to create social and environmental value. And what I'd like to do is to highlight a practical example of what I hope you could describe as being purpose in action. So if SSE's raison d'etre is to help deliver net zero, then we need to consider the factors that might get in the way of achieving this. And if we think of the industrial transformations of the past, which is effectively what we're going through in net zero, we know that the past transformations are not covered in glory in terms of the consequences for working people and their communities. And the Paris Agreement has written into it the importance of a just transition if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But usually this is being thought about, for example, coal miners transitioning to new jobs in green industries. And as Sharon mentioned, I've been a member of the Just Transition Commission in Scotland for the last 2 years. We published our final report last week. And as a commission, we deliberately took a broad definition of a just transition, and it being about workers, communities, and consumers. And effectively, we've thought about it as being the fair distribution of climate goods and climate bads. Climate goods are all the wonderful things associated with climate action, smart kit in our homes, clean air in our neighbourhoods, and opportunities for new skills and jobs. But the bad things are the costs associated with climate action, prices on bills or products or lost livelihoods. And SSE itself, in November, we published our own Just Transition strategy. Again, taking that broad definition, but considering the way we can use our business influence to support greater fairness in this transition. And within that strategy, we framed our thinking into two themes. The notion that we're transitioning into something new and green at exactly the same time as transitioning out of high carbon activity. And we make commitments to workers, communities and consumers about the nature of that new, the things that you would expect, like employment standards and standards in our supply chain. And in the process of transitioning out of high carbon activity, our first objective is to repurpose existing high carbon assets for a net zero world. But where we have no choice but to close plant permanently, we give commitments to do that in consultation with trade unions and their members. But interestingly, the loudest voice encouraging us to do all of this was a group of very enlightened investors, Royal London Asset Managers in particular, but there were others too, because they recognise, as we all probably do here today, that social injustice in delivering net zero could end up preventing the very investments and actions that we need to take in order to achieve it. So Sharon, I'll pause for breath and hope that helps give you just a very quick whistle-stop tour of the impact of purpose in the SSE.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And if I could ask the other panel members, Sul and Polly, to also put their cameras on now and to come off mute. It's been really great to hear how different companies and different organisations have tried to put purpose into action. We've got a range of techniques and approaches that people have used, ranging from, on the one hand, Polly at Anglian, changing your memorandums and articles of association to really lock in purpose, to in other companies setting clear targets, as Saul described for his work over a long period of time, to getting better at demonstrating the delivery of purpose and the principles that you've used to underpin that at SSE. Can I ask each of the panelists what you need to do to really lock in a commitment to purpose in a business so that it can withstand changes in leadership, both from in the executive team, but also in the board, and changes in investment? Polly, I wonder if I could come to you. Why did Anglian decide to go around the changing memorandum and articles of association route?
I think it's very important to note that that wasn't a huge change in the behavior of the company. What it was doing was formalizing something which I think had been in the company culture and values for a very, very long time. It did so because it recognized that increasingly it's not enough any longer to say to people, we're doing the right thing. People need to be able to see it, and the regulator expects to see it, and investors want to see it. So that was a formalization of something which I think had been at the heart of the company for a long time. And another formalization, of course, is also developing this BSI PAS. Those are two things which are actually effectively consolidating something which is been in place for a very long time. And the other thing I would say is that it isn't just about carbon. It was about that total sustainability package, looking at the nature, soil, water, soil and biodiversity, as well as water, that I think has lain at the heart of the long-term mindset of the company. But consolidating that and demonstrating it's an important part of, I think, also helping employees to see it more visibly in writing as well as just living it.
Thank you, Polly. So what has UKPN done to really lock in purpose in your business?
That's a good question, actually. I would probably say two things. One is about leadership, and two is about mindset. So what do I mean by leadership, right? And I think this is where it boils down to, if you think about it, when you're a leader of an organization, right, what defines success for you, right? If you think about that, what defines success for you? Most rational, thoughtful, well-minded people would say, actually, I want to leave the organization in better shape than which I inherited it. Right? That's normally that's how I think about it. When I joined UKPN, I thought, at some point, when I leave UKPN, I want to be able to say that the organization is in much better shape than when I inherited. That for me is the definition of stewardship, right? So I think firstly, it's got to boil down to leaders. If you have rubbish leaders that put, short-term profit, don't care about customers, don't care about the environment, then no matter what you do, whether you have articles of association updated or, it's just not going to stick, because at the end of the day, leaders cast a shadow. And if that shadow is a poor one, then, I'd be amazed to see organizations that do well with rubbish leaders, right? So that's the first one. You've got to have people that have it's in them, and they've got to have proper morals and values. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. And I think the second thing is about mindset, where if you can create a culture where people are comfortable in challenging and are curious about what impact they can have wider than the confines of their team, their directorate, their business, I think that does help to maintain a positive culture once the leaders go, right? And a great example of that would be, if I tell you about this example I gave you about the gap in charging provision, right? It's so obvious that there's a problem. It's so obvious, and it's so frustrating that there's so much bloody talk going on and not enough action. One of the ladies in my team who has joined us, only been here 2 years, come up with a great idea, which actually we spun up, have implemented as an innovation project, and is now going live in 3 areas about how we use market signals to tell us where there's market failure, right? Pricing. And the difference between what the market's willing to pay and what the cost is. It could be the cost that could potentially be socialized to start to pump prime the charging market, right? That was an idea from someone 4 levels down in an organization that had the curiosity, had the courage to say, we're idiots, we're sat there talking about it, why don't we do something? That's the kind of culture that, if you can do things like that, is much more powerful than rhetoric, in my view. So I think if you've got good leaders and good culture.
Thanks, Saul. Rachel, from the SSE point of view, how do you demonstrate that you've got leadership to a wide range of stakeholders who will think that you've got a large part of a monopoly business there? How do you really prove to the outside world that those leaders are putting purpose into practice?
Okay, I think there's 3 important things. The first is using frameworks, so using other people's frameworks. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are important because it's not about us defining what a sustainable world looks like. We're basically taking humanity's blueprint. And from that, that's not like a set of criteria set by investors or any of these millions and one ways of judging ESG credentials. This is just simply, what is it that we do that will contribute to a sustainable world? The second thing is about baking it into the structures. So this is about incentive structures. So we have linked executive remuneration to our big sustainability goals. Now, it's a moot point whether or not those people are more or less motivated by the fact that it's linked, but what it does is it gives a very clear signal to our stakeholders that we're deadly serious. The whole point of those goals is to meet them, it's not to not meet them. And by doing that, it means that, through the sort of machinery of the organisation, through the remuneration committee, the reports to the board, all of that sort of thing, it means that we are sort of tracking really closely the performance. And then the third thing is, above all, more than any of that, it's about accountability, and it's about accountability to all your stakeholders, and the lots of ways that we can do it, but arguably we maybe need to start creating some more ways in order to demonstrate that we are genuinely fulfilling the things that we've set out that we'll do.
Thanks very much, Rachel. We've had a question in from Kevin Smith from the UK Regulators Network, which says, are boards doing enough to represent the views of less fortunate customers and consumers? And how can you prove accountability to the full range of people and stakeholders that you serve? Polly, you've worked with all sorts of businesses, both in the utilities and more widely. How do you think we can really prove that accountability to the wider range of customers that Kevin's outlining?
Well, it's extremely difficult to prove that, other than to demonstrate the high levels of consultation and listening to customers through a whole variety of different fora where their voices are heard. As board members, we are out on a regular basis, out in roundtable discussions, in meeting different stakeholders, listening to them, trying to ensure that we understand the range of views out there, and building into the system ability to support those who have difficulty in affording to pay. So there's a whole complex system in there to try to protect those who can't afford to pay. What was interesting to me when we listened to those customers is just how many of them said that they would be willing to pay to protect some of the big system, to deal with some of the big system challenges that they know, that the customers know that we're going to face in the years to come, particularly focused on water scarcity and climate change, willing to pay a small premium for us to build a long-term future for them as citizens in the region. So I can only say that we've spent thousands of hours listening to customers and trying to factor it into our business plan and in how we communicate with customers.
Thanks, Polly. So I wonder, we've also had a question in from Simonetta at Royal London Asset Management, and she's saying, what can the investor community do to support policymakers and the policy environment to deliver fairer outcomes? And I wondered whether you've got any views in terms of the role of investors on those just transition issues and issues around supporting fair outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a so if I take it from a regulated business perspective first, that you know, I think investors can definitely influence the regulatory framework such that, you know, we have a balanced discussion about what is fair in terms of returns that continue to keep capital flowing into the sector, and at the same time balance that with what performance or what's the contract that customers in terms of value that are going to get from it as well. So I think there's definitely, you know, the way I think investors can support is helping to shape the debate, influence the debate, contribute to the debate about the regulatory framework, because they're the rules by which businesses like mine have to operate within, right? And they can have a massive impact on what we do and what we don't do. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is basically investors can demand you know, basic hygiene factors that all organizations should have in place. You know, investors should be able to demand, well, what drives the remuneration of the organization, its management, its leadership. You know, what is management doing? What is the leadership doing to understand how its services meet the needs of its customers and its citizens today and in the future? These are the basic questions that any investor can ask, and it will reveal a lot about the organization if the answers are not very forthcoming. So I think this challenge investors can provide to their own leadership teams, but also to the regulator in the context of regulated business.
And Helen Mosley has asked you particularly, so, you know, what UKPN can do to ensure that the customer is at the heart of the business. So building on that, what can your exec team do to really show that?
There isn't a silver bullet. There's lots of things, right? I mean, so I think if I read Helen's question, Helen's saying, driving performance improvement, I worry when presented with screens of operational metrics that the customer is lost, assuming they were there in the first place, right? Can you tell us what UKPN can do to ensure the customers are heart of the business? Okay, so I talked about our vision having three parts. The middle part of it is being a respected and trusted corporate citizen, right? So the first thing that we define within that is you've got to get the basics right. So how do we measure customer satisfaction with the services that we provide today, right? We measure that on a weekly basis, daily basis. We get nearly 13,000 bits of feedback every year through a regulated mechanism. Plus we augment that, supplement that with our own feedback loops from customers. And we drill that down right the way down to team level. So if you came into my business and asked an area manager, tell us what's important, the first thing he or she will say is safety. Then they'll say customer service. Then they'll say reliability. Then they'll say, you know, in terms of how they're doing on their investment programs and their costs. And therefore it's embedded. So yes, there'll be an operational dashboard, but you will see very clearly what our customers saying about our service. We then triangulate that, because that's a direct feed of when a customer has experienced something from us. We triangulate that with engagement, right, in focus groups with customers about their needs, not just today, but in the future. Like, and we show them stimulus, and we build groups of people that have interacted with us and those that haven't, and that helps us to shape our services for the future. So we're getting ready. And then thirdly, and most recently, we talked to customers about broader issues that are not to do with the service. So it's more about the environment and net zero and what are the challenges. And what we find from that is there is a huge knowledge gap. Customers understand sort of net zero, but when you ask them, well, what does it mean for you individually? And you start to put stimulus in front of them and say, oh, well, it could mean that you have to change the way you heat your home. There's a massive surprise there, right? And therefore, that knowledge gap, that's not me, sorry. That knowledge gap is something that we need to think of, be very thoughtful about. What role are we going to play to help plug that gap, and who will we work with, who will we partner with to support our customers in this next phase? So I think when you triangulate and bring these things together, you get a pretty good view, in my opinion, about what customers think about you.
Thank you very much, Sol, and many apologies for my phone going off there. We've just got time for a very, very quick question to Polly before we break. Polly, somebody's asked, you made the point about stripping out the complexity from the regulatory system and working out how regulation, the importance of regulation being developed in a collaborative manner. Someone's asked, whose responsibility is that, regulators or government? So very, very quickly before we break, who do you think should be responsible for leading that move to more greater collaboration?
Well, government's ultimately responsible for the outcomes we want. Regulators are responsible for helping us to get there and working with the regulated sector. I think this is, as Colin said right at the beginning, I think we need a new mindset which says we all know what the destination needs to look like, but we have to find ways of ensuring that we get there in the least complicated, in ways that avoid so much confrontation and start to see people with a shared common purpose. So I don't think it belongs in one camp or another. It is clearly, we know where the technical responsibilities lie, but the way you get there, I think, is going to be through much greater collaboration and co-creation. And I'm interested to hear later today. I'm hoping that's what you're all going to decide, exactly how to do that. That's not my field of expertise.
Well, that's a very good note to end the first half of the conference on. So thank you very much to our panel and to Colin Mayer, our fantastic keynote speaker, for a really stimulating start to the afternoon. We've now got a 5-minute break before we move on to hear the address from the Minister. So if you could join me again in 5 minutes' time to really start looking at some of those issues about policy and regulatory frameworks and how they can support this important agenda. Thank you. Right, we'll start again in a few moments. I hope everyone's been able to get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. Right, welcome back to our conference on fairness and utilities. And thank you very much for joining us for this second half. We've had a really interesting discussion this afternoon, hearing from a great panel of speakers and from our keynote speaker, Professor Colin Mayer. Colin has really explained to us how purpose can align the interests of companies, investors, government and wider stakeholders to focus on long-term issues. And our panel have really explored how, particularly given the low carbon transition, using purpose to align interests is going to be increasingly important. And it's increasingly important to ensure nobody is left behind, and to ensure when we get the sort of intrusive behaviour change that we will need around heat and around mobility, that happens in such a way that takes people with us rather than change being done to people. We've heard about the importance of leadership and culture, and I think that's a really good note to move on to our next address, which is from Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who's the Minister for Energy and Clean Growth at BEIS. As Phil has already described, Anne-Marie is unable to join us today, but she has sent us her virtual address. So without further ado, I'll pass on to that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and allow me to congratulate our hosts on the publication of their thought-provoking report. It is a culmination of 3 years' hard work and a stimulating contribution to the public conversation. I would also like to thank the organisers for their invitation to speak on this theme, the future of utilities regulation, at such an important moment for country and for climate. I am sure that this afternoon will see a very lively and productive discussion, and I'm very sorry I can't be with you to take part in it. I'd like to begin by saying straight away that I agree with Sustainability First's key message. Regulators and utilities, indeed all companies, have a crucial role to play in achieving net zero, social fairness, and many other public goods. If the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it's that our society expects all its constituencies to do their bit in the public interest. And I believe it is the proper role of government to encourage and enable this to the fullest possible extent. That's why we as a government have been working so hard on this front, and that's why I, as Energy and Clean Growth Minister, am so proud of the strong steps we have taken in the energy space in particular. We have, with our Energy White Paper, set out a clear, long-term policy vision for the sector as it moves to net zero, which provides the crucial context and clarity that the various actors in the energy system, including Ofgem, need in order to continue to drive decarbonisation and deliver value for consumers. And looking beyond the utilities sector, we are encouraging all large companies, including through targeted transparency requirements, to show how they contribute to wider social and economic goods. For example, we plan to be amongst the first G20 economies to require mandatory climate disclosures, with most of these requirements coming into force in the next 3 years. We also welcome the involvement of business at COP26 this year, and I note in particular the key role that the 3 companies that own and operate our electricity transmission network will play as principal partners. Turning now to fairness, I am particularly pleased to confirm that we will plan to publish soon a call for evidence examining the specific issue of fairness in the energy system. This evidence will be crucial to decisions on how to allocate energy costs in a way that is both fair and incentivises cost-effective decarbonisation. And of course, a key element of our concern for fairness is our special responsibility to the most vulnerable individuals. That is why we welcome Ofgem's continued work in ensuring safeguards are in place for vulnerable consumers, especially during this pandemic. But could we go further? Could we do more? I rather imagine that you believe we could. and you will be pleased to hear that we also believe that we can do more. We have supported the UK Regulators Network in its very welcome efforts to foster strategic coordination and expertise sharing across our country's regulatory bodies. But there is a need for more coordination and collaboration between regulators, perhaps most importantly, with a view to developing a whole consumer perspective on regulation, and therefore ensuring a better and fairer outcome, not only for all consumers, but especially for the most vulnerable. Indeed, we are very clear in principle that regulatory duties should be coherent and consistent across sectors, covering price, quality, resilience, and environmental sustainability. We have committed to exploring pathways to greater collaboration and coordination in a policy paper due out later this year. This paper will weigh up the merits of a cross-sector strategy and policy statement, since we see these documents as very robust instruments for giving regulators long-term objectives that are well aligned with government objectives and time horizons. We are also consulting this year on introducing a sector-specific strategy and policy statement for Ofgem, as we have already done in recent years with Ofwat and Ofcom in the water and telecommunications sectors. This consultation will set out the government's proposed strategic steer for the regulator, a clear sign of the kind recommended by our hosts today, in the interest of reinforcing Ofgem's key role in the fair transition to a net zero energy system. But let me be clear, we must not compromise the historically successful model of independent utilities regulation. While government and regulators must work together to achieve net zero and advance the cause of fairness in society, this collaboration should not undermine the principle or practice of regulatory independence. Our firm view is that forward-looking regulation by independent regulators remains the best route to a fair, affordable and decarbonised energy system. So I shall leave that there for now. We in government welcome debate on the future of utilities regulation, and I'm glad to have been part of this one in particular. Once again, I'm grateful to Sustainability First for giving me the chance to set out the government's perspective, and I encourage you all to respond to our consultation on the strategy and policy statement for Ofgem when it's published later this year. And in the meantime, I especially encourage you to respond to our call for evidence on affordability and fairness in the energy system. This is our chance to capture views on a complex and multifaceted subject, and your contributions would really help inform our thinking on this vital issue. Thank you.
Well, with many thanks to the Minister for that address, I think it set up the scene really well for my colleague Martin Hurst to talk about his research in terms of fairness and purpose in utilities. So over to you, Martin.
Thanks very much, Sharon. So it's always a challenge to represent the culmination of 3 years' work and a 70-page paper in 10 minutes and 6 slides, but I will do my best. Can I have the next slide then, please, David? So just to summarise, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that we don't have a unique set of answers here. This is very much a contribution to the debate, but it's a contribution to the debate that's been informed with in-depth conversations with regulators, with policymakers, and with the industry. The first point I think we should make, which very much echoed what was said in the first part of the conference, is that companies have a lot of freedom to do public purpose already. Certainly in law, but also more widely. They should use this, and many are using this. But it's a brave company and a brave set of investors that really push the boat out without having a degree of comfort that they'll be supported by regulators and they won't find the rug pulled out from underneath them. And the way the regulators work can do a lot to promote the agenda of public value and public purpose. It can also do a lot to get in the way of it. None of this, of course, is to undermine, as the Minister said, the regulator's key role in addressing the market failures around monopolies. I also have a lot of sympathy for the regulators, because it's a very brave regulator equally who pushes the boat out in this area without a fairly strong feeling that current and future governments will support them. That said, our feeling is that some of the regulated company interactions, they're almost institutionally adversarial. And the way that price reviews have been operated on all sides actually is largely as a series of what you would call one-shot games. In other words, you do this price review and then you move on to the next. And what you do in one price review has relatively little implications for the future on either side. Now, the institutionally adversarial system, if such it is, and the huge degree of bureaucracy in here is at best a bit distraction. It isn't regulator bashing or government bashing to say that 30 years after privatization, with the new challenges of net zero, climate adaptation, biodiversity in a fundamentally worse position than it was 30 years ago, a major epidemic leading probably to a big increase in deprivation, and all the technological change that has and is happening, that it is time, 30 years after privatization, as I said, to have a fresh look at how we should regulate in a disrupted world and how regulation and policy can enable the purposive approach that we believe is the best and indeed probably the only approach in a disrupted world. Next slide, please. As I said, this is very much not regulator bashing. There have been some phenomenally good things done over the last 10 years. And relative to when I was water director in DEFRA in PR 09, for example, I think Ofwat, for example, have made some real strides forward. And I know from my involvement in energy, the same is true on Ofgem. So it's not that the regulators are standing still. And I've just listed a number of things here that we think are really positive. So Ofgem's approach to the price review, trying to get more flexibility between the fixed points of the price review, what we call adaptive regulation. Ofwat, Rachel Fletcher, who will be speaking later, the first Ofwat chief executive, who I think even a regulatory chief executive, to really talk about public value. Equally, Ofwat's willingness to work with the Environment Agency, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, etc., on environmental water quality and water resources is genuinely path-breaking. The way that Ofcom have moved to much greater flexibility in their recent announcement on financing fibre, there has started to be more focus on customers in vulnerable situations, but you only have to look at those customers who are on vulnerability tariffs to realise there's an awful lot more we can do there. There's some early stage cross-regulator work on net zero, but I do think the regulators have been slow to really get meaningful joint work. The Financial Reporting Culture Council has started talking really sensibly about culture, and I think a lot of what they're doing is worth looking at. Next slide, please. So at the heart of our report is a fairly simple statement that a lot of this could be helped if we could rebalance the system so regulatory interventions and price reviews would concentrate on the things that only regulators can do well. That's things like the cost of capital, although arguably that could be done across regulators, major baseline TOTEX and ensuring that companies are efficient and are not overpricing, major new spend. Those are things that you need regulatory intervention to ensure and to protect the consumer against increased pricing. But there's a number of other things that regulators do at the moment that they could ease off on or work through other people on. So firstly, the whole concept of risk-based regulation, looking for third-party assurance, earned autonomy. So where, and I recognise that regulators will need a tough bar, quite a high bar here, but where companies are demonstrably working to a public purpose, they don't need as much dirigiste regulation as where a company is arguably swinging the lead. The ethical regulation approach, which has been adopted to quite a large extent by the Water Industry Commission in Scotland, has a lot to commend it in this area. We also think that regulators could free up relatively small amounts of spend, which at the moment involve a lot of bureaucracy, and leave the determination of these over to local engagement. engaging with communities, maybe local negotiated settlements, maybe deliberative fora, maybe talking to local authorities, but something which frees companies up to do this kind of thing without having to continually look over their shoulder at the price review and the CMA. And the final thing to do with regulators is the issue of regulatory culture. One of the things that a very heavy process orientation and price review orientation has done is it means that there is a very strong economic and econometric mindset in regulators. And if we're going to think about purpose, we need to have a culture in regulators that is as informed about citizens, environment and social factors as it is about economic factors. Next slide, please. So moving on to the government. It's great to hear the Minister starting to talk about the purpose of business regulation. In our view, government can talk a lot more about it. There's a real opportunity, as we've already said, in terms of the Treasury review of economic regulation. The Minister's already talked about new statutory duties, new strategic policy statements. We wholeheartedly endorse those. We also think government could give a very useful steer. The regulation isn't just about consumers and customers, it's also about citizens. The work on fair transition and just transition is really welcome, but at the moment it's all about net zero. Many of the people who Saul described as being most affected by the inability to charge a car at home are also the ones who will be most affected by urban heat and the health problems that come with 6 degrees increase in temperature rises in cities during the summer. The next thing is the utilities are one of the sectors where there is an obvious democratic deficit. In other sectors, like floods, where I do a lot of work, the government have very much encouraged measures to increase democratic accountability and address the democratic deficit. Thinking about what place means and how the government want people to work with local authorities is really important. Finally, all the regulators look over their shoulders at the NAO. If they do something good, the NAO don't comment. If they do something bad, the NAO beat them up for it. The NAO have to move towards more of a climate which encourages a fair degree of risk-taking. Final slide, please. So the big issue that everybody's been talking about is long-term future regulation. And this is the one which the price review, which privatisation really never quite addressed. So there's a number of bits of this in the report, and in the interest of time, I won't mention them all. But I will mention 3 of them in particular. The first is the role for adaptive planning, which is where you start with where you want to be in 2050, or in climate adaptation 2070, 2080, and work back, not work from what do we do in a 5-year price review, what can we do now? The second is the need for an institutionalised voice for the long term. We would strongly urge government and the regulators to bring the National Infrastructure Commission in here more. The final one is to really work through quickly, and I know regulators are thinking about this, how you do multi-price review projects and under what conditions do you adopt different solutions there. Thank you very much.
Now Maxine is going to welcome the next panel. Maxine, I think you must be on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't clear whether it was me or central control. Thank you, Martin, for those thought-provoking comments. And we now have a really excellent panel to join us to help think through some of these challenges, to give their own perspectives and perhaps hopefully respond to a few of Martin's challenges. So we've got, I think probably most of them known to you, Rachel Fletcher, Chief Executive of Ofwat, Lawrence Slade, Chief Executive of Global Infrastructure Investor Association, and then Giles Stevens from the National Infrastructure Commission. So perhaps if I could ask Rachel to kick us off. As Martin said, you were bringing the idea of a purposive company into utility regulation, the first regulator to do that. We really appreciate you giving us your thoughts as you kind of come to the very end of your tenure in Ofwat and the legacy you've left behind. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Maxine, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I guess my overall reaction, actually, to listening to everything that's been said today, and it's been a fantastic set of speakers, is I feel much more optimistic about where we are in water and the progress that we've made towards addressing many of the issues that have rightly been raised today. But let me talk about, I just want to make 3 points really about regulators and public purpose. I mean, the first is the reflection that I think through Ofwat explicitly recognising the public purpose water companies serve, and indeed raising the expectations about the public value that they should be delivering. I think this has been a really important part of moving things forward in the water industry over the last couple of years. And I think it's particularly helped to improve trust in the water industry. Harking back to some of what Colin said at the beginning of this afternoon, I think it has created greater alignment actually between policymakers and the water companies on the vision for the industry. So if you look at the draft Water UK vision document and Ofwat's own strategy, I think you'll see a very close alignment around where we are trying to get to. And I think actually this puts us in a much better place to address the challenges that the industry faces and to make sure that future generations enjoy resilient, affordable and sustainable water services. And just talking a little bit about that, I mean, it's always been obvious, hasn't it, that water companies provide a vital public service. But I think the shifts that we've seen in the last couple of years, two in particular, I mean, one is Ofwat requiring company boards to set a purpose for their company that reflects the wider impact and role that the company plays in society. And that really does embed this idea that the company and indeed the board is not just there to serve shareholder needs. And the second shift is a clarity, I believe, that Ofwat has given, that the gold standard is no longer simply compliance with regulations. Water companies have got a massive potential to provide even more for their local community or for their environment in the area through the choices that they're making as they run their business. Who do they employ? How do they go about cleaning up rivers, for example? And of course, Ofwat has set itself an ambition that companies will increase the public value that they serve. So it's one of our 3 strategic goals. And I think in making these shifts, something really important is I believe we've been tapping in to a strong public service ethos that's always existed within the industry. And I think we've been drawing on the desire that many in the industry, including leaders in the industry, have to make the strongest public contribution that they can. So I'm certainly not claiming that the focus on public service and improving public value has originated in Ofwat. But I think that by the regulator explicitly recognising this wider role, I think we've helped to embed and to cement public purpose into the fabric of the industry. And I believe that we've already got things to show for this renewed focus on public purpose, the ambitious public interest commitments that the water industry have made, including on net zero by 2030. And I believe, and I think it's quite evident actually, that public purpose really helped frame the industry's excellent response to COVID and the commitment it is now showing to contribute to a green recovery. And I believe that that focus on public purpose is beginning to shape how many companies are now looking at the longer term. What is their strategy? What's their business strategy for delivering public value for future generations? And this is a great development. The second point I want to make, though, and this is where I might be slightly at odds with other speakers, is that I believe that Ofwat has got a dual role, two roles, that we need to perform at the same time. So we do absolutely need to create the conditions that will enable companies deliver the greatest possible value for society, including long-term value creation. And in doing that, I think we need to give companies space to take ownership and decide what this means in practice and in the context of the communities that they serve. And we also need to continue to protect customers where there are no market disciplines to do that job, and where customers can't vote with their feet. In short, if customers pay more than they need to, or if the public feel investors don't deserve the returns that they've earned, then no amount of carbon cutting or local job creation can compensate. The industry will fail on its public purpose and lose trust. And of course, this will be bad for investor confidence too. So I believe it's important that Ofwat finds a way of doing both these roles at the same time. Indeed, this is what we've been trying to do. We cannot and we shouldn't release the focus on efficiency. So difficult conversations with companies, I think, are inevitable. In fact, I believe that they are necessary, although there is definitely also room for collaboration, or as a thought was Sewell mentioned earlier on, he used the phrase campfires, which I thought was great. You know, there's a role for collaboration in campfires, but it can't, the conversation with the regulator cannot be limited to that. I'm happy to talk later about some of the things that regulators can do to enable companies to add wider and deeper public value. But certainly at the heart of this, I believe, is an outcomes-based regime. And one of the things that Ofwat is doing is working very hard with other regulators to make sure that the entirety of the water regulatory framework is outcomes focused. The last message from me is actually that where we need to go and how the regulatory arrangements need to evolve, I think is going to entail a degree of mess, a degree of learning and discovery, and we've got to embrace that, I believe. I think, you know, particularly as we test out how we strike the appropriate balance between protecting customer short-term interests, for example, and meeting some of the long-term value creation ambitions that we all have for the industry. We've got over £1 billion worth of green recovery proposals sitting on our desk in Ofwat at the moment from the water industry. And we're working through some really interesting issues. I mean, should customers pay for cleaning up environmental damage caused by parties other than their water company? How should you schedule investment for long-term value creation in the best way possible, where you've got multiple objectives, both environmental and, for example, on water resilience, or indeed removing lead from the system? So how do you schedule that investment? And I think there is considerable scope for win-wins, opportunity to provide public value with no or little impact on customer bills. But where we are not in that win-win territory, we have to grapple, I believe, with these difficult issues. I think, as I said, these green recovery proposals are a great opportunity to learn. We are committed to working through these tricky issues with companies. And I believe that that is going to create a great foundation for PR24. And I invite the water companies in particular to work through these issues with us and help us create an even better approach for the next price review. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think the mess is what Martin is looking for, some tolerance from people like the NAO to recognise there will be mess as we try to learn. Right, next we have Giles Stevens, who again, like Rachel, has experience in both Ofgem and Ofwat, but is now leading thinking at the National Infrastructure Commission on how the regulatory framework needs to evolve to meet some of these challenges that we've just been talking about. Over to you, Giles.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Thank you for welcoming me here today. It's great to be here, and I'm really pleased to be part of this interesting conference and to have the chance to give comment on the report. For background, the Treasury asked the NIC to carry out a study into regulation at the start of 2019, which we published in that October. The timing of the study took place during, I think, an almost peak loss in confidence in some of the utility sectors. Our social research, which we carried out as part of the study, supported that. So, for example, 50% of customers were satisfied with value for money. So that's only 1 in 2, and less than 60% were satisfied with their customer service. And I think this was accompanied by an emerging narrative over whether ownership models were fit for purpose. And there was a growing voice calling for renationalisation. So it's no surprise that our study and our work looked hard at these issues. Indeed, our report was entitled Strategic Investment and Public Confidence. The 8 buckets of recommendations that we made roughly divided equally under these headings of investment and public confidence. And at the time, we undertook a lot of work to consider how to address the public confidence question. I think in particular whether we should specify or specifically recommend that regulators require firms to develop a social contract or mandate that they act formally for a public purpose. And we stopped short of that, which on the face of it might put us at odds with the work of Sustainability First. However, in reading a lot of the regulation for the future report, I find a lot of similar issues that we explored, the majority of which we recommended supports what is in today's report. We very much agree that government needs to set the direction for what it wants from the sectors, that regulators' duties need to reflect that direction. We think that those duties should include duties to bolster long-term resilience where they don't have them, and to work towards the net zero target. And we also found that we felt that a duty to coordinate was needed as well amongst the regulators. So I think an up-to-date, refined but complete set of duties, along with up-to-date and coherent strategic policy statements, and we heard mention of the energy one earlier, is a firm part of that landscape. It helps to expose and decide on the trade-offs by those best placed to manage, and Rachel alluded to some of that just a second ago. I think the NIC agree from both our regulation study but also our resilience study that to deal with a significant long-term investment, there needs to be a departure from the current 5-yearly settlements. We did take a different approach in some, or a slightly different approach in a few areas. While we both agree on taking a more longer term approach to strategic investment, the NIC suggested a greater role for competition in doing that. We made a formal recommendation for greater use of competition for strategic enhancements, which we felt should cover design, build and operation of assets. So get that, don't automatically assume it goes on the monopolies books. And it's through that you get the real value and innovation. And in relation to public purpose, while not making formal recommendation, we did conclude that there needs to be an emphasis on public purpose by company boards, which could be an important contribution to greater public trust. But it will be important that this goes beyond superficial activities and leads to genuine change. And that's why I'm very pleased to see the proposals today. Finally, the government did formally respond to the study, to the 8 recommendations we made, alongside the government's national infrastructure strategy at the end of last year. In the response, government committed to the forthcoming policy paper, which the Minister mentioned, and indeed some of her wording about the system needing to capture price, quality and resilience came from our documents, so it's pleasing to see that. And as she mentioned, it will look at the strategic direction, duties and role of competition, all of which in the context of bolstering customer confidence, I think is more than important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Really helpful to join up with the Minister's comments. Okay, now we have Lawrence, as I mentioned, heads up the Global Infrastructure Investor Association. I mean, the investor community, as we touched on earlier, is taking an increased interest in these issues, the ESG agenda. So I guess question for you is, how far can investors help push this purposive agenda?
Thanks, Maxine, and thank you to your colleagues at Sustainable First. I think this is a super report, and actually the conversations we've been having with you over the last year or so have been really valuable, I think, in opening up the discussion. And I think that was one of the first things I wanted to say, actually, that the sort of we've heard words like partnership and collaboration a fair bit this afternoon, and I think those are really critical elements of this in terms of how we can all work together to solve some of these problems. And I think it's, yeah, as the afternoon's developed, there's been some really key points made, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later. I thought for my intro comments, though, I might just sort of take a quick spin through where we've got to. At a meeting a while ago, someone from a regulator made a useful point that I think it's useful from time to time for us to look back and try and understand why we are where we are. And I think if you reel back to the beginning of the last decade, around then, just after the financial crisis, at that point, yeah, the UK had a gold standard as far as it was concerned in terms of its regulation, reputation, the environment that was there for companies and consumers post privatization. But I think around that time you started to see a little bit of an erosion of that, and that was sort of reflected a lot around the increasing pressure on bills, and then as we saw the decade come through, as the last speaker said, around political pressure on topics such as nationalisation, etc. So we started getting some of these problems in, and I like to think of it maybe as a little bit of a pendulum that sort of is swinging constantly between returns for investors and value to consumers. And I think somehow part of this discussion around regulation and value and fairness needs to ensure that that pendulum is in the center, i.e. it's being as fair as it possibly can the whole time to the customer, but also to the companies and the investors in terms of those returns. And I think, yeah, as we got to the end of the last decade, in some respects, we had started to lose that confidence in the market from an investor point of view, because we had seen the sort of the short-term decision making that reflected a lot of the political issues, of course, but also we saw issues around nationalisation. And that created in many commentators' minds a sort of situation where there was a bit of a no-go almost around UK and investing in the UK. So a complete switch around from just a few years earlier, which shows how quickly these things can change. But on the flip side, around that time, we also started to see really important discussions around the need to decarbonise, the need to protect our assets, our infrastructure from climate change, the need to invest in resilience, in adaptation, and in zero carbon technologies. So that suddenly opened the door to a conversation and said, hang on, we need literally tens of billions of investment here. How are we going to manage that? What's the best way of doing that? How do we actually ensure a just transition? How do we ensure no pockets of consumers are left behind? How do we work together on this? And I think that's actually where we are today, if we decide to grasp this metal. And whether it's our report on the future of regulation, Sustainability's first report, as Martin highlighted, or the NIC's, or indeed the future Treasury report, I think the thing that sits in the middle of this is we all need to work together to understand that balance between the investment needed and the end user, and how much we all pay for what, as Rachel said, is an essential service ultimately. And it is that equation which, to my mind, is quite simple if you write it down. How do you deliver billions of long-term investment and achieve intergenerational fairness? The answer, unfortunately, is a bit harder. Now, in addition to all of the issues around decarbonisation, we've also, I think quite rightly, started seeing more of an emphasis on ESG. Now, the G element, governance, has been talked about for quite a while, and I think rightly so. And some of the earlier speakers today, I thought, made some brilliant points around articles and embedding values and purpose in that, but also the role of boards, etc. But I think it was really great, and it is great, to see more of a discussion around the environmental, but also the social issues or the social responsibilities of companies. And let's have a debate around that social contract and actually what we're doing to understand the values that we can bring to the communities around us and move those forward. But I think those debates, and that can only happen if we have clear guidance issued to sectors from government. So we need those clear policy frameworks. We need that clear direction issued to the regulators that I was glad to hear the minister talking about. And then we all need to take those opportunities to work together. And I like Saul's comment around the sort of the campfire. I think that's a great idea and way to look at it. And I thought, yeah, we want more of that. We need more of these discussions. And Rachel made an interesting point where she thought she might veer away from some of the findings, but her comment around the dual role I found was actually really interesting, because actually, she's right, there is a role for a regulator to create value in an asset, absolutely. And there's also a role for a regulator to protect customers. But surely, if I'm an investor in an asset, I want both of those, because the better service my asset is providing, the more valued it is by its customer base. And actually, the higher the asset value ultimately is in terms of the end value to society, to customers, to future investors. So there is a joint agenda here. But I fear that over the sort of past 5 years, we became a little bit too pugilistic in our approach to negotiation, in our approach to these conversations. And I think it's critical now, with so much on our agendas around decarbonisation, around social value, around climate adaptation and resilience, we have to work together. And I think we've got to draw a line under what's gone before and say, right, how do we move forward in the 20s and 30s and 40s? Because infrastructure is not a short-term play. Infrastructure does not play between one political term and the next. It plays between multiple terms. So let's use all of this opportunity to really understand how we're going to work going forward.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was a good riposte. There's probably an interesting debate I could have between you and Rachel on some of those points, which we might come back to. But what I want to do now, because I'm aware we've allowed you slightly longer to kind of set out your stall, is to go to questions from the audience. I will sacrifice asking my own questions unless we have time at the end. I mean, the first one that's sort of been upticked in the voting at the minute from Kevin Smith, UKRN, about the duty to coordinate, which you mentioned, Giles, and links to the minister's statement. And there's also a bit of a similarity here with the next question from Becky Ford about actually companies needing to act collectively to achieve, you've got, energy system transition. So perhaps a few thoughts on what a duty to coordinate means. Do we need a cross-sector SPS? What's the best way of achieving this goal that I think we all recognise the need for? I'll start with Giles, but Rachel and Lawrence can chip in if they've got thoughts.
Thank you. It's a really important question. I think some of what you're trying to achieve by it is to avoid contradictory regulation. So it's worth trying to put that more in place. I think you're trying to promote efficient outcomes for consumer on some cross-sectoral issues, trying to get an all customer view and thinking about distributional impacts and the overall bill levels, something about best practice on data sharing. All of that I think is worth doing, and I think it's fair to say that UKRN in various guises has looked at some of those issues. So what is it above and beyond that the coordination duty would give you? And I think it gives you partly the bite to ensure that regulators are doing it and hold them to account. And I think a lot of the experience from UKRN in the past has been that some regulators have probably taken a more proactive approach to coordination than others, investing significantly in their time and staff to it. And I actually think that having a coordination duty helps centralise and stop the risk of backsliding, if you like. So I definitely support it from that. I think it only works, though, or really is efficient if you have the duties themselves coordinated, which is why we proposed that original set. And you need to be aiming in the same direction where appropriate with net zero, resilience, etc. So I think that's the sort of rationale for it. Just to pick up the last point about the sort of local devolved sort of side of things, that is really important. I think along with customer bodies, experts in that sector, the sort of devolved regional side, locally elected mayors and stuff, it's worth getting that voice into, which is something we've recommended as well in our study.
Thank you, Giles. I might take the next question in a different direction, which is to go back to Rachel's point on the dual role for that Ofwat plays. And as somebody said, so Lawrence was challenging you and sort of saying they can't really be separate, and these assets are meeting both of those roles. Whereas Martin had kind of tried to almost pull you apart and say, well, can't you do your price control for part of your role and then actually find other ways that are outside the system for dealing with some of those other elements of your role, whether it's the sort of social or the local environmental piece, where perhaps other approaches might be more effective than bundling it all into the 5-year price controls. Do you want to just respond to that, building further on your two-role point?
Well, I think the first point to make is that I think we do a lot outside of the price control. It's interesting, I mean, the focus on the S in ESG. I mean, there's very little in the price review that is, if you like, goes directly to social issues. And I mean, some might say that's a weakness of the price control. I might say there's a real opportunity actually for regulators and companies to, improve the focus on economic inclusion and vulnerable customers in parallel to within the AMP, as it were, rather than waiting for the big bang of a price control. So I think there's a lot that does happen outside the price control. I don't know exactly, maybe I slightly misinterpreted Lawrence's point, but I mean, I don't think we can't be schizophrenic as a regulator. We've got to find a way of synthesizing, using the right tool at the right time in order to achieve the overarching goal. And I think a lot of what Martin talks about, which is about being clear about what your long-term objectives are, and then it's a question of what's the right tool to get there, recognizing that in some cases you need quite prescriptive standards and challenging cost allowances, and in other areas there's higher risk. You might need to be using other tools, for example, the innovation fund that Ofwat's just launched. So I think there's, I think we've got to get comfortable with, and I hope people are seeing regulators, working in different speeds and using a range of different tools. I mean, the last thing here is, I think that I think there's a lot happening already, and I think Martin acknowledges this, on the how do you get long-term investment away. And I would say, I mean, in the water industry, there's a lot of long-term planning that happens. Every 5 years, there's a rerun of long-term water resource planning, of drainage resource planning, and that drives quite a lot of infrastructure investment, which might get, if you like, authorized in a particular price control. But there's obviously a recognition it's going to take multiple regulatory cycles to deliver. So I think we've got a process for dealing with long-term assets. I'm sure it could be better, and we're trying certainly to improve the approach to investment for water resource adequacy. But I think what is missing for me, and I hope that we can move closer towards this ahead of PR24, is that there isn't, you've got these various separate statutory planning requirements, which when you lay them end to end, don't add up to a holistic plan. And so the need for companies actually to really say, what is my long-term plan for my business? What is it that I want to achieve? How am I going to leave things in a better state for future generations? And what does that look like? That I think that needs extra emphasis, and I think we will get it in PR24 if I'm reading the tea leaves right. We also need to be grappling, as I was indicating in my remarks, with some of the sequencing of the different investment needs, and some really applying brain to how do we sequence water resource investment, removing lead, investment for growth, etc. Is there a way of thinking about the sequencing of this that can actually help with the affordability and the public acceptability of what it is that we're trying to do? So I think we need to make strides on both that holistic planning and really everybody grappling with how do we deal with these big ambitions in a responsible way.
Thank you. That's a big picture. Go back to the questions that's been voted up next. It's around duties. So John Hargreaves asked, you might conclude from what people have said this afternoon that we should place duties on sector regulators different from those they have now. Do you agree? And if you do, what would be the new duties? Inter alia, should we cease referring to them as independent, which actually isn't anywhere in the statute, but it's kind of an important principle. I mean, perhaps if I start with Giles, just very quickly to recap on, I mean, you've talked a bit already about duties, but anything that's still on your shopping list that government may not be responding to, but you still think they should be doing. And then perhaps Lawrence, from outside, to kind of a view of any other changes to the duties that you would like to see happen. So Giles first.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think it is clear that in some cases, as I say, you've got resilience for a number of them, and net zero is obviously coming through in the energy space. But I think it's worth thinking across the piece for leveling that up. To my point about the sort of coordination, I think the interesting question comes, you always get it, and I'm speaking as an ex-regulator of 20 years, you're horrified if somebody's adding an extra duty in, so I just don't really want that. And then say, okay, well, what will you take away? And nobody ever puts their hand up for anything. Now, I do think this government review is an opportunity to review that fully, actually, and say, are there parts of it that need to be taken away, and maybe moving towards the outcomes, which is probably more what we set down, which moves you to a long-term framework, and then have a shorter-term, tools such as competition innovation. Do you really need to specify that? But I do think in this debate, the role of government in some of those tensions, the more duties you add in, the more tensions, of course, but you're closing the circle, if you like. Government need to be clear and have a role in those trade-offs, and I think that's where we disagree slightly with what other people have said, and perhaps the government response. We think they need to be clear on some major distributional options, and we propose that in one of our recommendations that at the moment government haven't picked up.
Yeah. So Lawrence, I mean, obviously having an independent regulator is one of the things investors have always been keen on, and the minister was clear that independence was important. Is there anything, does changing the duties help? Is there anything that in that space that you worry?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the independence element has got to be maintained. We'd like that to be maintained, but I think that we need to clarify. I think there has been a sort of a blurring of the boundaries at times between government and the regulator, and I think we need to clarify those boundaries and make those clearer. And I think part of that does require the sort of very clear strategic policy guidance from government to the regulators, setting them up. I mean, if you think of when the regulators were set up, the world that was in place then compared to the world we're in now, it's radically different in so many ways. And I think we have to take a fresh look at the duties, and a fresh look in terms of where are we going over the next couple of decades. So I think it is something we need to do, clearer, clarify the boundaries between government and regulators, and then update the regulatory duties set out in legal statute for future challenges going forward.
Thank you. Skimming on down, there's a question here from Sean Canty, talking about our recommendation that the NIC should play a role in So it scrolled itself off my screen. To play an additional formal role in regulatory coordination and coordinating a long-term vision, as well as doing a study on regional imbalances. Are these ideas that the NIC would support? So I think part of this was, one of the things we talked about was a voice for the long term. Is that a role that the NIC is happy to take on?
So I think I would say that is our role, and it is a voice that we have. If you look through our resilience study, our regulation study, the long-term focus, and in our national infrastructure assessments, the second one of which we're kicking off in earnest now, is giving you that long-term view. So definitely tick for that, and that's our remit. On this point about formal coordination for regulators, though, in the long-term vision, I think we've given a bit of that in the regulation study, and we've given those recommendations to government. And I think so there is a question as to whether or not we could do more in that space, and we clearly have been in there. But I think government need to step up themselves and have their own role about what the long-term vision is, and let's see what that is. And a lot of our recommendations, such as in resilience study, that ask for a review of standards every 5 years, is asking government to be clear what it wants there. And then finally, on the doing a study on regional imbalances, really important question, certainly in the levelling up and productivity and recovery space. We have just started off a study, a town study, which you will see on our website, which is exploring some of those questions and the roles that utilities can play in that space. Some utilities can space. So that's certainly, again, supported. The only caveat, I think, for us doing much more in this is we're an organisation of 40, and clearly we have 6 sectors and an awful lot to do. So I think in terms of us getting much more into depth in any of these sectors, that would clearly, or in regulatory issues beyond what we've done, that resource issue is a clear constraint for us, along with what we're required to do by government in our remit.
Fine, thank you. And then question from Nicolette Boter, which I'll pass to Rachel, about the balance between national regulation and more local place-based regulation. Does that need to change in view of net zero and biodiversity? Obviously local and place-based is very important in the water sector already, but do you see that balance shifting?
Yes, I think it would be good to see it shift. I think there's a question actually about what you need at the local level actually to be hooking in for a utility to be hooking in and being really clear about how it's playing a role in the place-based ambitions, whether they're social or environmental. And one of the things I find really interesting actually is that in Wales, they've now got local regional plans for environmental improvement. And I think one of the questions for Ofwat as we go into PR24 is, well, what's to what extent should we be expecting the Welsh company business plans to really have engaged with those local plans and really be part of supporting them and helping to deliver them. So I think you probably will see regulators shifting in that direction, but I think it's a lot easier to do if there's a local infrastructure to hook into. And I think you're seeing that to lesser and greater extents on different parts of the planning arrangements.
Okay, thank you. So I just really wanted to wrap up now, but so I kind of one very quick question to all of you, but so you'll need to keep your answers really short, which is the kind of if there was one thing the government could do to help move this agenda forward, what would it be? So I shall go to Giles, then Lawrence, then Rachel. Giles.
Issue a very good the forthcoming policy paper, make sure it's very, very clear, grapples with issues, sets a very clear direction, deals with the recommendations from the National Infrastructure Study on Regulation clearly, and sets a clear foundation for and strong long-term commitment to the future, I think.
That's easy. Lawrence.
Probably quite easy for me as well. I'll just build on that a little bit, and I think the strategic policy guidance, updating that is absolutely critical and that long-term commitment vital.
Thank you. And Rachel.
Yeah, I think setting some really, really firm long-term goals for the different sectors and working across departments where those goals overlap to make sure they're consistent.
So that's excellent. And I think that does resonate. I mean, for a long while, I think Sustainability First was banging on about strategic policy statements well before they got back into fashion. So I think that theme, and obviously it's not simply the document, it's the thinking and everything else that goes behind it, which you've all just articulated. But so thank you all very much for some really thought-provoking contributions to this session. And I'm now just going to hand over finally to Martin Sigsworth to kind of wrap up with some concluding remarks. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Maxine. David Sigsworth it is, but sorry, I've just lost my screen.
We can see you, David.
Just on. This is quite embarrassing. Here we are. Well, look, at the outset today, Phil Barton said that we were to examine fairness in utilities and what the public purpose agenda meant for companies and policymakers and regulators. And interestingly, my own career journey includes direct involvement in the privatisation of the Scottish electricity utilities, and particularly in the development of the initial regulatory regime. And a few people have said that's 30 years ago now, and since then we've had a lot of organic development. But what I've taken out of today is that many of our speakers and questions have emphasised that now we're in a decisive decade for the climate, and the challenges have been rolled out: the net zero challenge, the climate adaptation challenge, rising deprivation. That's just a few. So my first conclusion is that today's conference seemed to me to be very much in agreement that now is the time to actually reset the system. And secondly, the changes discussed today, I don't see as a leap in the dark. Policymakers and regulators are not standing still. We've heard that they're already putting some of these things discussed today into practice. And we heard from the Minister that purposeful regulation is front of mind in the government's thinking. And that was certainly echoed by Rachel and Giles when looking at specific regulatory challenges in their organisations. If we just turn to the presentations that both Sharon Darcy and Martin Hurst made, I think they demonstrated the depth of thinking in Sustainability First recommendations about the very practical steps which can be taken to get public value-based regulation broadly adopted as an urgent need. And it's that provides my third conclusion, which is that action by government's needed rather than theorising. Sol mentioned that, but Martin has mapped out the activities required. So let's just get on and do it. Because certainly in Scotland, I've been involved in the adoption of ethical regulation and also, risk-based regulation in the water and the environmental regulators regimes. And in my view, that's been a game changer. However, I think that my fourth conclusion is really encouraging and probably one of the most powerful, because all our speakers from utility and infrastructure providers, along with their major investors, demonstrated their awareness of the need for a defined purpose in business. And we heard how their businesses are changing to embrace that principle. And no one was saying that there isn't an ongoing and important role for economic regulation. But as Martin said, regulators should be concentrating their efforts on what I think he said only they can do. And we should let regional and community involvements have the space to grow.
for me personally, I thought it was really good hearing from Colin Mayer, because it was reading a transcript of a talk he gave some time ago, which introduced me to the idea that every business should have a well-considered purpose, and that should be to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and the planet, and should certainly not be focused on profits per se. And I think Colin's keynote address provided us with a great depth of understanding of his work and how it's supporting the required transformation of business and regulation to purposive ends. So that heralds my fifth and final conclusion. And that's that the aggregate of today's discussion told me that there was a consensus view almost that focusing on public purpose does provide a way forward to get the culture change and to build the trust needed for repairing a disrupted world. That's about as much as I've got time to say, but I do want to close by reflecting on how today's event will influence Sustainability First's ongoing work in its Fair for the Future project, because certainly there's a lot of mileage in wider communication and pressing home of the very practical solutions offered in Martin's paper. However, we believe we've shown leadership in this area for over 2 years now. We kicked it off. Much of the debate in the UK resulted from our initial debates, and that's now much more widespread. In fact, very recently we've seen Mark Carney weighing in with his thoughts in his book, Values. I just hope that our considerable experience gained over time will be accessed during the course of the promised reviews of regulation and of fairness in energy. And I suspect, as I now hand over to Sharon to close today's proceedings, that she'll probably have more to say on that subject. But thank you. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you very much, David, for that excellent conclusion. And to everyone for taking part in what's been a really stimulating debate today. The points that have been raised will really help us at Sustainability First shape our responses to the Treasury forthcoming review of regulation and to the Bayes study into affordability and fairness in the energy sector. We're going to be doing a phase 2 of our Fair for the Future project, which is going to really start to look at some of these issues around strategic policy statements and regulatory duties that the panel have just been speaking about in far more detail. This is the time to tackle these issues, and we've got a tremendous amount of research, as David has said. We need to just get on with doing it and putting that thinking and that experience into practice. The other area that we're going to be taking forward as Sustainability First is a new project on sustainability principles. As David has said, Mark Carney has recently published a new book called Values. We've been planning our new project for some time, and it will absolutely be looking at how you translate issues around principle into practice as we go through disruptive change. We've heard this afternoon from Colin about the need to really align the interests of companies, investors, government and wider stakeholders as you go through change. We think values and principles are crucial to doing that. We've heard about the difficulties companies face working with their financiers, with government actors, with regulators, in terms of working through difficult issues and dealing with messy trade-offs. Values can help in those campfire discussions, and values and principles can help us as we go through these changes. So we'll be doing some more work in that area, and we'd love to hear from you if this is something that you'd be keen to work with us on. We are a small charity, we have no core funding, so we rely on working with others and partnering with others to deliver this cutting edge work. So please do get in touch if you'd like to work with us in either of these areas as we go forward. In the meantime, my colleague Alice will shortly be putting in the chat, if she hasn't already, a link to a survey that we're doing of conference attendees to really find out what you thought about from today's event and what you might do differently as a result of this conference in your own work. So please do fill that in and tell us what you think. So to conclude, I'd really like to thank everybody who's taking part in the conference today for your contributions. It's been a fantastic discussion. I'd like to thank our panels of speakers and the people who gave us the keynote addresses, so Professor Colin Mayer and to the Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan for their really inspiring words. And I'd like to thank all those who asked questions for really helping keep us all on our toes. But I'd also like to really thank my colleagues at Sustainability First for the great work that they've done in this area, particularly to Martin for his fantastic report that really sets out these issues so clearly. Yes, it's a 70-page report, but there is a very short summary at the beginning and a list of really concise recommendations. Do look at it if you haven't done so to date. I'd like to thank Maxine for chairing her session so well, and for our colleagues Judith and Fiona and Zoe, who behind the scenes have really helped us hone our policy positions in these areas. And of course, my colleagues Alice and Janine and David for their fantastic support in getting us to this point. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our sponsors, without whom this work wouldn't have been possible. I think they really helped shift the dial on issues around purpose in utilities, and we look forward to working with you all in the future. So I hope everyone can go out now and enjoy the sunshine. It's still sunny in London. I hope it is where you are. Have a good afternoon.